Hi everybody, thanks for coming along. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the complexity of translationally invariant problems beyond ground state energies, which is work I've been doing with the two handsome gentlemen at the bottom of my screen, Johannes Bausch and Sevag Gharibian. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of motivation for the talk. So one of the kind of main motivations of studying quantum computing is to study physical systems that are too complex to solve classically or analytically. And typically we model physical systems as k local Hamiltonians. So H, my Hamiltonian, is equal to the sum of a set of permission matrices, Hi, which act non-trivially on at most k qubits or k particles. And often we're interested in restricting Hamiltonians to be simpler in some sense by imposing some kind of physical constraint on them that kind of mimics physical systems. For example, translational invariance, one-dimensionality, nearest neighbor interactions, where particles can only interact with particles that are geometrically next to them. And typically, these kind of constraints on Hamiltonians make computing the properties of these Hamiltonians easier. And in this talk, we're going to examine the case, or to what extent this is the case. And we're going to examine sets of Hamiltonians that are physically motivated and see how easy it is to find their physical properties. So one of the key problems in condensed matter physics is determining the low energy properties of physical systems. The reason this is kind of interest is because lots of kind of interesting and weird quantum behavior takes place in this regime. So kind of superconductivity, superfluidity, and other kind of highly non-classical behaviors. And if we want to investigate this regime, we need to be able to make local measurements. You can imagine that if you're an experimentalist in the lab and you want to probe your material with, I don't know, some experimental probe that you have, this is kind of like equivalent to making local measurements on the system. And then from that, you gather data and reconstruct what's going on in the system. So a very natural question to ask is, if I give you a local Hamiltonian H and a measurement that I want to make A, can you tell me the expectation value of A at low energies? And we can kind of formalize this problem with the following computational problem called the Approximate simulation problem, or APX SIM. In this, I give you a local Hamiltonian H acting on n qubits, a local observable A, which we're trying to measure, and a set of thresholds alpha, beta, delta with these conditions. I promise you that either all states that are delta close to the ground state in energy either have an expectation of the value A, which is less than alpha, or an expectation of A, which is greater than beta. So in some sense, this is kind of like formalizing the notion or formalizing the problem of approximating the expectation value of A to 1 over poly precision. So another problem we're going to be interested in is the ground state connectivity problem, or GSCON. So loosely, this asks whether there's a energy barrier separating parts of the lower energy subspace of my Hamiltonian. So in this, I give you a Hamiltonian H. I give you two ground states of this Hamiltonian, phi and psi. I ask, does there exist a sequence of unitaries, a poly-length sequence of unitaries, mapping psi to phi, such that this sequence of unitaries, or every intermediate state it generates, has low energy with respect to the Hamiltonian. And the output of this problem is yes, if such a path exists, and the output of this problem is no, if no such path exists. And you can maybe think more intuitively about this problem being about distinguishing these two kind of, whether the Hamiltonian is one of these two energy landscapes. So on the left here, we have a kind of flat low energy landscape where I have two ground states denoted by these purple dots, and there's a kind of short path between them. On the other hand, I have my two ground states noted by these purple dots, but there's an energy barrier between the two. I'm asking, I'll give you a Hamiltonian, which of these two cases occurs? And maybe there's kind of another motivation for studying the ground state connectivity problem, GSCON, which is if you think of your Hamiltonian as an error correcting code or a quantum memory, then if the Hamiltonian is a yes instance of GSCON, there must be a short sequence of local unitaries mapping between local energy states, between low energy states. And if this Hamiltonian is a quantum memory or an error-correcting code, these low energy states are code words, right? They encode some sort of information. So if the Hamiltonian corresponds to a yes instance of GSCON, there is no energy barrier in the system between these code words, and so we expect the system to be able to easily move between these code words. And furthermore, since the system remains in the low energy subspace between these two code words, we don't expect the system to violate any kind of maybe stabilizer checks going between these code words, and so it must relate, so it remains in the low energy subspace, and we don't expect to be able to detect this. So this is essentially another way of saying that the Hamiltonian is a poor quantum memory or poor error correcting code. So determining what the Hamiltonian is, or determining the kind of low energy subspace structure of a Hamiltonian is kind of very well physically motivated. Okay, so let's move on to the results of this talk. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about complexity classes, just a little bit on notation. So by the class P to the C, what we'll mean is the set of problems solvable by a polytime Turing machine, which makes poly-many queries to an oracle for the class C. P to the C log is the same, but I'm restricted to log many queries, or rather the Turing machine is restricted to log many queries. And P to the parallel C is the class for which Turing machine makes poly-many queries, but they're non-adaptive. That is to say, the input to one query can't depend on the output of previous queries. So you can think of all the queries being made at once. And we say that QMA exp is the version of QMA in which the verifier has an exponentially large witness as input and an exponentially long runtime. So you can think of it as like the exponentially larger class of QMA in the same way that exp is to P. And finally, QCMA is the version of QMA in which the witness must have a classical state. Sorry, must be a classical state. That is, I'm only allowed to submit classical states or classical descriptions as proofs. Okay, so what are our results for this talk? Well, first I thought we'd address the how hard is it to simulate measurements on low temperature states or low energy subspaces. So we show that if a family of Hamiltonians admits a circuit to Hamiltonian mapping such that the local Hamiltonian problem is C complete, then the APX SIM problem for the same family is P to the C log complete, provided C that allows for error reduction. So here, the local Hamiltonian problem, if you're not familiar with it, it's just the problem of approximating the ground state energy of the system. So in the same way that APX SIM is a formalization for measuring or approximating the expectation value of a local observable, local Hamiltonian is a formalization of measuring the ground state energy of the Hamiltonian. And we also show that for the GSCON problem, the question of whether there's an energy barrier in the low energy subspace, that if a family of Hamiltonians admits a one-dimensional circular Hamiltonian mapping such that the local Hamiltonian problem is QMA complete, then GSCON is QCMA complete for the same family. So our main results is that we have these two lifting lemmas, the APX SIM one being slightly stronger, and we get a series of corollaries out of this, or kind of immediate corollaries that follow from these results. So two kind of important ones are that APX SIM is P to the QMAX complete for one-dimensional translationally invariant nearest neighbor Hamiltonians, and GSCON is QCMA complete for one-dimensional translationally invariant nearest neighbor Hamiltonians. So both of these classes, P to the QMAX and QCMAX, are expected to be highly non-tractable for quantum computers. And so this is maybe perhaps a surprising result, right? One-dimensional translationally invariant nearest neighbor Hamiltonians are kind of like the simplest, non-trivial Hamiltonians that you might expect to exist in nature. It's really not clear how you might simplify them. And yet, even finding the ground state properties of these Hamiltonians is, hugely intractable even for quantum computers. So maybe this is a surprising result. I thought I'd compare these results to just some of the previous literature. So previously, APX SIM has shown to be P to the QMA log complete for log local Hamiltonians when it's first introduced, then to 5 local Hamiltonians with 1 local observables. And finally, recently it was shown that it's P to the QMA log complete on physical models like 2D Ising model physically motivated models, and some 1D Hamiltonians. So our result here is the first result with translationally invariant Hamiltonians, and it's kind of more physical than some of the other instances here. The GSCON problem, when it was introduced, was shown to be QCMA complete for 5 local Hamiltonians. And it's also been shown to be QCMA complete for 21 local commuting Hamiltonians. So in the GSCON case, we've really got the first result showing that this problem is computationally difficult for a realistic set of Hamiltonians, or kind of a physically motivated set of Hamiltonians. The Hamiltonians proven here are really kind of very unphysical even. Okay. So those are our main results. I thought I'd give an overview at a very high level of some of the proof techniques we use to prove our results. Hopefully they'll be interesting and somewhat, yeah. Okay, so I thought I'd start by showing the containment of APX SIM for the class with QCMA. I'm actually going to just consider the case where C is equal to QMA. So this is a proof due to ambiness. And the idea is that we want to show that if a local Hamiltonian problem is QMA complete for a family of Hamiltonians F, then APX SIM is contained in P to the QMA log. So we can do this by allowing our Turing machine to first use a binary search and query a QMA oracle to estimate the ground state energy to 1 over poly precision. So we're just kind of finding initially the low energy subspace that we want to make our measurement on. Then once we've done that, simply ask the oracle for a state near the ground state in energy and measures the observable A. And this requires log many queries to the oracle in total. So, maybe diagrammatically, it's slightly easier to understand. If lambda min is my ground state energy that I'm trying to approximate, I query my oracle with alpha and beta, asking whether there exists a state with energy less than alpha or not. Then it presumably in this case replies that there is, so we choose another alpha beta to query, and then we get a result from that, and then query another time here, and we slowly narrow down where the ground state energy is. Then once we've found a good approximation to the ground state energy, we ask the oracle for a state close in energy to the ground state energy, and then measure our local observable on it. Okay, so that's containment. And one other thing that's really worth noting is this binary search procedure is really the motivation for why you should expect the APX SIM problem to be P to the QMA log complete. In order to single out the low energy subspace, you have to make a bunch of queries to find the low energy subspace. Okay, so now I thought I'd run you through the hardness proof, which is a little bit more involved. So what we want to show is that if a family of Hamiltonians F admits a circuit to Hamiltonian mapping such that the local Hamiltonian is C complete, then the APX problem must be P to the C log complete. Okay, so rather than proving something about the class P to the C log, we'll instead take the parallelized class where we make queries in parallel. So we make poly many queries to our oracle C, but in parallel, so we can make all these queries at once. And it turns out that these two classes are equal to each other. And this greatly simplifies analysis, because it means that we don't have to analyze the case where one query depends on another query. And it doesn't matter so much if our Turing machine makes invalid queries or something that doesn't satisfy the promise. We can kind of ignore that for the moment. And we just consider, in this case, this diagram, a bunch of QMA queries, and we use some kind of post-processing on it with a classical circuit. Okay, so what we actually do is we take the circuit and we replace all of the oracles with their own verifier circuit. So rather than having an oracle that we query, we just have a verifier circuit which takes both an input Q and a witness W. And we have a bunch of these, M of these, and we input our problem or problem instance X. We also have a flag qubit, which we label here at the bottom. And what happens is each of these verifier circuits will take the input and the witness. And when it's They'll output 0 or 1, depending on whether it's a yes or a no instance. And they'll rotate. And what we do is we introduce these rotation gates, which act on the flag qubit. And if the verifiers output a yes instance, what we do is we slightly rotate by a factor of √3 on 2m the final qubit in this circuit. So in some sense, we do this for all the verifier circuits. In some sense, our flag qubit at the bottom here counts up how many yes instances there are in the circuit, or how many yes instances outputs from the verifier circuits. And then all the outputs from the verifier circuits are fed into a kind of polytime post-processing circuit and output on this bit Q out at the end, or output on this qubit rather. And again, I just want to emphasize that this last qubit, the flag qubit, records the number of yes outputs from the verifiers. Yeah, so these are the states of the two kind of output qubits. You have Q out, which is approximately in the all 0 or 1 state, and that encodes the output of our P to the parallel C computation. Whereas the flag qubit is in some state characterized by theta, where theta is proportional to the number of yes output verifiers. Okay, so this is the circuit we have, and this solves our P to the parallel C problem. And what we want to do is convert that into a Hamiltonian such that measuring a local observable tells us the answer to this Q out problem. So the natural thing to do is something that we've been doing for a while now in Hamiltonian complexity, is to push this through a circuit to Hamiltonian mapping. And we choose the circuit to Hamiltonian mapping, which is relevant for this particular complexity class. And what we can do is we can energetically penalize the flag qubit being in the 0 state. And this ensures that no instances from the verifiers are penalized as much as possible. So the ground state of the Hamiltonian, which encodes this circuit, corresponds to the largest number of accepting witnesses. So these witnesses here are unconstrained in some sense, and we want to force it so that they're non-deterministically chosen in some sense to have the greatest acceptance probability. Then Q out corresponds to the computation in which each witness accepts with the highest probability. So we're kind of trying to locally optimize the acceptance probability of each of these verifier circuits such that the overall output is or corresponds to the yes. So I guess we're locally optimizing each of the verifier circuits so that the overall output is correct. And then what we do is we choose our local observable A to be a projector onto our output qubit, such that measuring this projector on the low energy subspace is equivalent to measuring the projector onto the 1 state on the output state of our computation. And because this tells us the answer to a P to the parallel C computation, this means that measuring A on low energy states is P to the parallel C hard. Excellent. So that's the kind of outline of the proof. There are maybe some remarks to make about it. So a big plus of this construction and this kind of lifting lemma that we get out of this construction is almost the entire simulation of the P to the QMA log machine was done circuit side. So it preserves any properties of the circuit Hamiltonian construction that we used, for example, one dimensionality or translation invariance. And because there's nothing kind of particularly special about any particular complexity class here, we can apply the circuit to a whole range of complexity classes. So if I give you a D to the parallel C circuit and a relevant circuit to Hamiltonian mapping, we can give you back a APX SIM hardness result. And there's one con though, and that's that this construction requires that the verification class C have some sort of error reduction. This doesn't this means that we can't apply it to any arbitrary complexity class. In particular, stock MA causes problems because we can't do its error reduction. But as an aside, there are APX SIM hardness results for stock MA Hamiltonians. Okay, so that was a kind of brief outline of the APX SIM proof. I'll quickly run through the GSCON proof, and hopefully it'll make some sense. So what we want to do for the GSCON proof is we want to design a Hamiltonian for which traversing the ground state subspace is equivalent to a QCMA problem. So remember, this is the problem of distinguishing between whether the ground state has an energy barrier, or sorry, whether the low energy subspace has an energy barrier between different sections of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose a circuit Hamiltonian mapping that's one-dimensional and translationally invariant and nearest neighbor for our purposes, and with a ground state psi history, which encodes a QCMA X instance. And in particular, this Hamiltonian is going to have high energy above some beta if it encodes a no instance, and low energy if it encodes a yes instance. What we're going to do is tensor each qubit in this system with another 7-dimensional qubit labeled BI, which we're going to use to turn on and off parts of the circuit to Hamiltonian mapping. So our circuit to Hamiltonian, so the overall Hamiltonian is going to look something like this, where our circuit Hamiltonian mapping here is tensored, or is only turned on if the associated kind of auxiliary 7-dimensional qubit is in states 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And at the end here, we have this e to the b, sorry, we have this EB projector, which penalizes certain configurations of the auxiliary qubits. Its structure is very non-trivial, but for the purpose of this talk, we're just going to ignore it. It prevents some certain strings occurring. And this Hamiltonian has two zero energy states, all zeros in both registers, or 7s in one register and zeros in the other register. And we want to show that traversing the path between these two states is QCMA hard. So let's see how we can do this in a yes instance. So we start with the all zero state. And what we can do is we can immediately compute the history state of the circuit Hamiltonian mapping. And it turns out that both of these states have zero energy. The reason is that we haven't yet turned on the circuit Hamiltonian mapping because we're still in the all zero state. Then what we do is we slowly flip the auxiliary qubits to be in one state. And what this does is it turns on the circuit Hamiltonian mapping. So now this final state in this chain here has the property that it has energy less than alpha if the history state, or if the circuit Hamiltonian mapping has energy less than alpha, and the entire state has energy less than beta if it corresponds to a no instance. Then what we do is we continue flipping these bits in a certain order. So all the ones get flipped to 2s and then to 3s, all the way up to 7. And this has now turned off the circuit Hamiltonian mapping. And this final state, what we do is we uncompute the history state, and we end up back at the other ground state that we're interested in. And this has zero energy again, because we've turned off the circuit Hamiltonian mapping terms, Hamiltonian even. And we see that if H prime, the circuit Hamiltonian mapping Hamiltonian, has a ground state energy which is initially less than alpha, then all states in this chain have energy less than alpha, and we always remain in a low energy subspace. But if H prime has a ground state greater than beta, then at some point along this chain, or indeed all along this chain, we end up in the high energy subspace of having energy greater than beta, which corresponds to a no instance of GSCON. So you could think, okay, what happens if we attempt to take a different path between phi and psi, the one outlined, which could avoid the high energy subspace? You indeed could do that. However, our construction prevents you from doing that. And we use this nice tool from Gharibian and Sakura, which essentially says, if you try to move between two orthogonal subspaces, then you always have support on a third subspace orthogonal to both of them. And what we can do is use this E projector that I said had complicated structure to penalize that subspace sufficiently. And the result is that we get a Hamiltonian that has a short low energy path between the ground states, if and only if H prime corresponds to a yes instance. And otherwise we end up in the high energy subspace. So in summary, we develop a lifting lemma for APX SIM. Roughly, if approximating the ground state energy is hard, then approximating expectation values on the ground state or close to the ground state is also hard. And it implies that APX SIM is P to the QMA X complete for one-dimensional translationally invariant and nearest neighbor Hamiltonians, and GSCON is QCMA X complete for the same class. And finally, just to say that this shows that Hamiltonians being one-dimensional, translationally invariant, and nearest neighbor does not simplify the ground state properties of Hamiltonians as you might expect. Thank you very much, and let me know if you have any questions.